The retail side of the federal government, I'm talking about agencies that confer benefits on people, that interact with people frequently, are being activated only in areas that are of benefit to the Biden administration, blue areas. One such example, in Michigan, the Small Business Administration has job centers. When all this money that was passed out of the last Congress, the trillions of dollars starts flooding and juicing the economy before the election, people who will be getting jobs at these job centers will be encouraged to get out to register to vote and mobilized in only those blue areas. So right now, every single one of you here is actively supporting the re-election campaign efforts of the Biden administration with your taxpayer dollars. They're particularly active in places that I view as, frankly, predatory. Native American reservations. What we've discovered is they've picked Native American reservations that they think are hard blue, voters that they want to get, and they're sending children home with packets to give to their parents, getting them to vote for Joe Biden. This is playing out across the country. It's happening in our prison systems. Okay, think of it this way. One huge advantage that the left had in 2020 during COVID is people were physically locked down. It was easier to know where people were. So now without that advantage for the left, the government is going to places where they know people are. College campuses, prisons, Native American reservations, job centers. All of that is being directionally pointed in only one way. This is totalitarian dictator behavior, using the government and the resources to ensure your re-election. That is absolutely unprecedented. I could go on with many more such examples, but I want to turn it over to my good friend Josh here, who has ample experience in the election integrity field.
Well, I think that's exactly right. And to build off of what you're saying, one of the biggest takeaways for me from this exercise is that it really mirrored real life. When we were talking about the law enforcement involvement in election integrity in this scenario here, I think in my game, the sheriffs were deployed to help ensure that there was no voter suppression, right? What we're seeing in real life, though, is a concerted effort in battleground states to take away the power to certify elections from local elected officials. It's a fascinating thing. In Georgia in particular, there is a big-time effort to take away that power to certify elections, to even ask questions from local elected officials. The question is, though, if you're a Democrat, you would only do that, if you're a member of the Biden administration, you would only do that if you were really confident that you would win, right? I think what we learned from this exercise, though, is that there is a good chance that the administration is going to deploy the Department of Justice. We're already seeing them mobilizing the Department of Justice to go in and help local election officials, to be able to determine the outcome of voter suppression, to prevent violence against them, things like that. I think one big takeaway is that we have to watch out for the other side to deploy the Department of Justice, just like it's deploying government resources across the board to protect what it calls an election in victory, but we'll see what that actually means.
Yep, and to foot stomp on that great point, and I'll put it even more bluntly, I'm formally accusing the Biden administration of creating the conditions that most reasonable policymakers and officials cannot in good conscience certify an election. And they're trying to remove their ability to make that decision. This is going to be an election that has massive levels of distrust in it, no different than the 2020 election. Whereas we stand right now, it is the least trusted election in American history, and for good reason. They're trying to take away one of the only checks on that system, which is the ability to not certify obvious fraud, whether that fraud is coming from illegals, whether that fraud is coming from illicit ballot harvesting, whether that fraud is coming from deploying the federal government as your political campaign, whether that fraud and election interference is coming from trying to imprison not only your chief political opponent, but many of his supporters and ideological aligned individuals. That's what we're seeing right now. And I think that is one of the biggest threats in our constitutional republic's history, is removing the ability of the people to actually decide who their elected leaders are. That's the threat. And that's something we get into in this war game exercise. Chuck and Adam, we have a few minutes left. Do you guys want to speak a little more to the contents of the report?
Wow. So I think it's, again, important to emphasize that this was not preordained. In other words, this was not a canned exercise with any sort of a fixed outcome. There was a lot of back and forth and a lot of unexpected developments. And I think one of the things that again, another element that kind of shocked me as time was going on was, as Joshua Findley mentioned, the inappropriate use of Department of Justice assets, the FBI, in claiming that there was civil rights violations at the state level, Voting Act violations, and that therefore there needed to be a federal intervention in the certification or validation process of that election. That then caused a certain tension because, of course, under our system, the states have the power to determine the results within their own territory. And this was an attempt to usurp that effort to, in one case, reverse the outcome of the election. And it was just interesting to see the concrete way that unfolded, where you had people who had experience at a high level. Their own professional experience was at a very high level in an administration, so they knew what they were talking about. And to see this unfold in our exercise was very sobering, because you're looking at it and you think, oh my goodness, I certainly hope we have some people that are prepared to really do a knockdown, drag-out fight legally to try to prevent such a thing from happening.
Absolutely.
I think if you read the descriptions of how both exercises unfolded, you'll be quite surprised, and it may seem ludicrous. And I guess I want to say that if you're like me and somebody had told you in 2019, yeah, next year there's going to be a brand new virus, it's going to cause a global pandemic, we're going to shut down the entire economy worldwide, schools, everything else. Then we'll have mass riots in the streets, which will be allowed despite the crackdown on being in public spaces. And then we'll have an election full of fraud. I would say that sounds like nonsense. Of course, we've lived long enough now to recognize that these things at this point in our nation's history, it's kind of like you don't know what could and couldn't happen. So when Iran tested a nuclear device during our exercises, that's a huge event. Is it far-fetched? I don't know. How would we respond to it? When they attack our water systems, the jungle tigers from the Chinese, right? Is that far-fetched? I don't know, right? I didn't expect Barbra Streisand to get kidnapped by Hamas. I didn't. These are the kind of national emergencies that we need to be prepared for when they happen. So I would encourage you all to read the narratives of the report.
Now, Adam, the FBI did rescue her the next day. Okay, so I just want to make it. They pulled themselves away from looking after mothers keeping tabs on their school boards long enough to rescue her. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone...
Barbara's fine.
Yeah, okay.
Media that's here, please let Barbara know that she's fine.
Mm-hmm. Josh, any final kind of thoughts?
I think the biggest thought is just we need to be prepared for anything. Really, some of the scenarios like Barbra Streisand seemed a little bit absurd, right? But the bottom line is we need to be prepared for anything in this election. If you take a snapshot of today, I think we're in a scenario that none of us could have imagined. And imagine what it's going to be like 4 months from now on Election Day. That's an eternity in the world that we're living in right now. And if we don't plan and prepare now, we're going to be caught off guard. We have to prepare and be ready.
That's absolutely right. And I'll speak to kind of two other ongoing threats that are happening as we speak. And these things kind of become normalized, the cable news cycle and the hyper-partisan divide in this country. But there's two threats happening right now that we're tracking closely from our perspective, particularly at the Oversight Project. One is President Biden even going to run or stand for re-election? And if not, is it even possible to legally substitute and withdraw and present a new candidate? Our legal research, which we've done across 50 states, shows it's an extraordinarily difficult and cumbersome process. There are different timelines that need to be adhered to, conditions that need to be met. In some states, the conditions required admission of incapacity. Is this White House ready to admit that the president is incapacitated? Can you be incapacitated for the purposes of reelection, but have capacity for the purposes of continuing your presidency? These are real legal threats that'll play out in real time. And from where we're sitting, we're going to make sure we are best situated legally to confront those threats. Because the story of 2020 is you cannot run an election by making up rules as you go. And you certainly cannot do that when the rules only favor one side. That is why Americans rightfully have historic distrust of the outcome of that election. The same fact pattern could play out with regards to replacing President Biden. And so we're tracking that very, very closely. Another thing that is a form of election interference that I think is absolutely unprecedented, particularly legally, it is what is happening with the unlawful withholding of the audio tape of Biden's criminal interview with Special Counsel Hur. Okay, recall that they released the transcript. Recall that Special Counsel Hur basically found President Biden incompetent to stand trial. There's an audio of that interview. That audio belongs to everybody in this room. There is no legal reason or prohibition from it being released. We have sued for the release of that audio tape, along with many others. The president claimed executive privilege, one of the highest powers that he holds, to hide a politically embarrassing audio tape of himself. Something that, in my estimation, would probably make what happened at the debates look like small potatoes. So right now, Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, is acting as nothing more than the top campaign lawyer for candidate Joe Biden. That is against any notion of democracy or a constitutional republic, any which way you want to frame it. They're hiding evidence from you that belongs to you because they know it'll end him. That is wrong. And those are the types of election interference schemes that we intend to fight. This report, I believe, will serve as a great body of evidence for the American people and policymakers to confront with, to engage with, and hopefully to better anticipate these threats as they emerge in real time. We don't know exactly what the threats will be, or at least all of them, but we know there are going to be a ton of them. And so with that, thank you all very much for all of your hard work, and I'm going to call up the next panel. All right, so we're going to get into a little more of the nitty-gritty with some of the participants who played specific roles in our project here. So I'd like to invite to the stage Derek Cohen, Mike Waller, Anthony Rubin, and Brendan Weichert. Real quick, a note of personal privilege for Anthony, who might not brag about himself. We've done a lot of work with him and his group, Muckraker, who do incredible undercover journalism operations. You guys can grab your seats, by the way, if you'd like. Anthony, in this war game exercise, played the cartels. You might be thinking, what does a 27-year-old have any business pretending to be the cartels? Well, how is he qualified to do that? Fair question. Here's the answer. Because he was kidnapped by the cartels. Him and his brother went down, embedded in a caravan that took all the way up to the U.S. border, and were captured by the cartels. So in my estimation, nobody knows more about how the cartels operate than Anthony Rubin, who was kidnapped by them. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to these gentlemen. Mike Waller will take the lead in kind of moving the discussion along. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mike, for setting up this wonderful event with these guys from Texas Public Policy Institute. This has been quite an exercise, an academic exercise, and an in-practice exercise. And part of the excitement of it was we had a lot of real-world stuff to base it on. So in the case of my capacity, I was the whole intelligence community plus the FBI and Department of Justice. So I was presuming that Obama's man, Maher al-Bitar, who is the Palestinian on the National Security Council responsible for all intelligence programs and special counsel to the president, assuming that role and what he would play was part of the looking at this, as well as Merrick Garland, meaning you didn't need an active president in this type of scenario. And the surprise was that the intelligence community could do pretty much what it wanted because it could move faster and more secretly than the president, anybody else in the administration, Congress, or anyone else. So it was quite a revelation to see this play out in real life, not knowing who your counterparts were necessarily. So let's start. Also, the other thing is how foreign actors can influence and do influence our political system and our decision makers. So let's start first with you, Brandon, as one of the evil players.
Yeah, I had a little bit of fun, as Chuck mentioned, going roughshod as China. Basically, I went in to the event thinking if I were China, if I were Xi, there's a very short window of opportunity that you have to exploit, because China has a lot of problems it's facing on its own. And in order for China to really move the geostrategic ball forward in the way that they want, which is to basically create a co-prosperity sphere in their region, and Taiwan is the linchpin of that, they're going to need a weak American leader. They're going to need an America that's distracted. And in my summation, Joe Biden is the perfect American president for that group that's running China. He is obviously addled. He does not know what's going on. He's also got some odd connections with China financially through his son, who's apparently now a White House advisor. But so there's a lot of weakness from Joe Biden, and I thought that, A, China's going to want Joe Biden to stay in power, but B, also, maybe they can just push Joe Biden over the edge. He's distracted with an election issue, and they're going to be able in China to maybe get, maybe not the whole island of Taiwan, but certainly those outlying frontier lands as part of a salami slice strategy. So think of Kinmen and Matsu and even Penghu Islands. These are sort of the frontier islands closer to China. If Xi could acquire those territories, he's got perfect launching pads now into Taiwan for him to basically apply pressure however he wants. And so that was sort of the underlying thought process, and I operated off of that assumption throughout the game. Oddly enough, Joe Biden seems to have woken up and retaliated, but it's still a win for the Chinese because the chaos and the misery that is ensued allowed for China to really kind of acquire its geopolitical objectives. I also was doing things at the domestic front. I think at one point I funded Antifa. I gave them some money to go crazy. And that was in relation to a story that came out of, and Claire Lopez knows about this, a story in Houston in 2020 where the U.S. government shut down the Chinese consulate there because there were Chinese agents of influence operating out of that consulate. I have personal knowledge that the Chicago Chinese consulate, going back to 2011, was very active in doing subversive activities in the American Midwest. So I was doing things like that as well.
Great. Derek Cohen, tell us who you played and what you did.
Yeah, so I took the role of local law enforcement, then moonlighted as Greg Abbott once or twice when the need arose. And what I was doing was, unbeknownst to me, reacting mostly to mostly to what he was doing. But it's interesting from the perspective of law enforcement. Law enforcement itself, and I think that breaking it out, and I called Chuck and Adam dungeon masters earlier, but breaking it out within the game for both local law enforcement, being your municipal law enforcement, and then your local sheriffs, which obviously be your county law enforcement, was actually was a very good setup, mostly because they have a much different incentive structure in the various flashpoints that we found within the simulation. You know, what we find with local law enforcement, with local sheriffs specifically, is that while they do tend to be probably more conservative as a set, they are definitely not a monolith, because absolutely most every county in the United States has them represented, and they kind of map onto the political preference of that particular county. So if you look at what actually happened during the simulation and the roles that had to be played by the local sheriffs, obviously the local sheriffs do two primary things in most counties. One, they run the jail. So they're the ones who have to, when we do have incidents, we'll say, cropping up, however originated, they at least have the long-term effect of dealing with that, but not only. But they also are the vanguard of law enforcement within those rural counties. So in other words, in areas that don't have municipal coverage or municipal law enforcement, they would be the agency of first resort. Now, where did this crop up in the two simulations? One of the ones that jumps right to mind was in simulation number 1, essentially where I don't know how many of y'all have been following what's been going on the Texas border, but one of the flashpoints on the border is Shelby Park within Eagle Pass. And within Maverick County, where that is located, you got to go a step back and explain how the Rio Grande Valley kind of exists currently geopolitically, is that it is a very heavy Democrat voting area of the state of Texas, but we find that, obviously that's changing as we speak, but we also found that if you look at the political preference there in terms of policy, even communal values, it tends to be a pretty conservative area, one that rivals even the rural areas of the state. And so what we had, I believe, was Antifa or BLM taking over Shelby Park in one of the detention facilities or one of the Operation Lone Star facilities that we have down there. And in responding to that, Maverick County and the surrounding sheriffs basically just drew a hard line in the sand, and that effort was actually supported by the state's law enforcement apparatus through Governor Abbott and our state Department of Public Safety. So that was just one of the flashpoints that we dealt with. Now, what a takeaway from that would be that individuals in local administration and local government are going to need to be prepared for whatever comes their way. And that's not just because, in blue counties or red counties, because as both simulations have illustrated, both counties have had these local disturbances. And as the vanguards of the civic order and of civic peace, that's probably the biggest takeaway for both law enforcement and local sheriffs.
Great. Anthony Rubin, what did the cartels do in these election exercises and not do? And how do you see them, how do they matter this year?
Right. So I played the part of the cartel, but also I would say I took on the role of the illegal aliens as well, kind of them as a collective, predicting their flows. So to start with the cartel, this wasn't just the Mexican cartel. That's probably what comes to mind for most people. But this was the cartel that spanned these different organizations that span along Central America and go into South America, as far south as the Darien Gap. And so to kind of take it from south to north, first starting in Panama, right? The criminal organizations that control the flows of illegal aliens through the Gap into North America. The newly elected president of Panama has promised to shut down the Darien Gap. And so in this simulation, we accounted for that. We predicted that it's really not going to amount to much because it's like a moving freight train. You can't just cap it off one day, right? So despite the efforts of President Mulino, these cartel criminal organizations are still going to be operating in there. They still have entrenched interest on the Colombian side and on the Panama side. And so we're not really going to see much of a stop in the flow. If anything, it might pick up. And so that's what we saw later on in the exercise as we got closer to Election Day and then post-Election Day. We predicted that, with a Trump victory, what we will see is actually an increase before the inauguration, but after the Trump victory in illegal immigration to the United States, because these people will not, these people are very smart. These people are tracking what's going on, and by these people, I mean the illegal aliens, are tracking what's going on with U.S. policy. As soon as Joe Biden was elected back in 2020, immediately, like almost right after Inauguration Day, there was a massive flow at the southern border. When Title 42 was dropped, we saw a massive flow. So, again, after the election of Trump in this scenario, we see a massive spike in illegal aliens that are looking to get up here before Trump is inaugurated, and then before he likely caps the inflow of people through the southern border.
So you saw no cartel involvement in this exercise in the elections itself?
Right. So as far as the cartel goes, their interests are to keep their business operations running as usual, right? They don't want to rock the boat. They want to protect their economic interest and, rock the boat as little as possible, as I've seen firsthand. So whatever that entails. And we didn't see any major actions. I was looking for actions as I was playing the cartel. I was looking for actions that might have, impacted us from Mexico, for example, possibly from Mexican military immigration, stopping the flow of people throughout Mexico or stopping it from Guatemala into Mexico. We didn't see that. So again, it was business as usual.
So was there any involvement between the Chinese and the cartels in any of them?
At one point, I believe I did indicate support for what was going on. I can't remember specifically, though. I remember a lot about the Antifa stuff, but I'm pretty sure that I was infiltrating teams of saboteurs through the broken border, and I thought the cartels were helping them move. I can't remember quite specifically that instance, though.
Right. Well, that's to bring it back to the illegal aliens, and there were instances of special interest aliens making headlines. Right, people from Syria or China that were flowing across in areas like Jacumba, California, and that will continue. I mean, in this scenario or in real life, I mean, that is what's going to happen up until the election and beyond it, up until Inauguration Day. And so we did account for that, and I believe at one point there were special interest aliens, I forget what country they were from, who were caught with blueprints of a water.
Yes, that was
Right.
that was China. That was one of my little scenarios that we need to be prepared for is the infrastructure attack. We're already seeing Vault Typhoon cyber attacks going on, and it's only going to escalate, I believe, going into the election. And just so everybody knows, I was in Game 2. There was 2 different games going on, so I don't really know what was going on with Game 1, but I know in Game 2 I was pretty heavily interested in exploiting the infrastructure weaknesses, and we have a lot of them in this country. And I know that there was some degree of coordination between moving our people, the Chinese, through the broken border.
Derek, were you in Game 1 or Game 2?
I was in both.
Both. Okay, so I was the FBI trying to usurp your authority and then take credit for what you were doing.
I remember that.
Yeah, so we're trying to be true to form here. Okay, so in real life, though, you would have FBI coming in, offering its assistance, and then taking credit for all your work, and then you don't get the budgets to do what you need to do, and then the FBI gets budgets to do other stuff.
Well, after my 2 decades of involvement with law enforcement in the real world, I can't tell you a single instance where that would have happened. That was. But that's a very good point, is especially to Mike's point that he was making earlier, is that you had essentially a usurpation of the, I said, the preservation of the civic peace, but that would go as far as to apply to the administration of elections as well. And so I remember, I believe it was actually it might have been actually in both of them, where we did see federal involvement within local elections. Now, we didn't necessarily have to mirror that or to stand in the gateway or stand in the entranceway of polling places. We essentially, we being the local sheriffs, essentially just tried to stand off and serve more as monitors in the counties wherein that made sense. But I do think that highlights another issue that we're going to deal with, and one that I actually that arose with the dealings that we had with local law enforcement, municipal law enforcement, I should say. One of the simulations, I believe it was simulation number 1, but I'm not sure off the top of my head. There was a massive protest, whether it was we had 2 waves of protests. We had a lot of protests, whether it was BLM, Antifa on one side or migrant activists on another. This one was BLM Antifa, and I believe there was an incident at Trump Tower. I went to the person playing municipal law enforcement and said, well, the surrounding in prime New York City, the sheriff is basically what we would consider in almost every other law enforcement capacity, more of a constable, almost like a bailiff, but not the way it is in the rest of New York County. So I said, hey, one of the things you can do, if you need support on this, we can definitely deploy assets from outside of New York City to come help, whether it's jail capacity temporarily or manpower capacity up front. We can help you deal with this problem. And the individual that was playing law enforcement rightfully observed, and this is exactly what would happen in real life. He goes, "Do you think the NYPD would ever take outside help?" And that really kind of stymied the reaction to that, as he deliberately sat on his hands on that, because that is probably likely how that would play. Now, what that actually highlights is something that we've seen in the academic side of law enforcement, that we've been studying for 30, 40-odd years, and that's this hitch in interoperability. We hear a lot about interoperability when it comes to usually post a crisis. Obviously, in Uvalde in Texas, interoperability was a big hiccup in the response to that incident. This would also be also a hiccup in response to an incident, should we actually see it in the situations contemplated by the scenarios, simply because the actual incentive structures, to say nothing about the command structures, of these different law enforcement agencies are not aligned. And so unless we get a common understanding, and that's only going to be able to exist at the state level, that promulgates down to both the county and the municipality, there's actually not going to be a whole lot of interoperability when it comes to not only responding to a high-profile event, but even multiple very small events.
Yeah, there's so much in here, because once you get law enforcement involved, the mere allegation of something can affect everybody across the board, from lawyers and prosecutors and bureaucrats to politicians and the media. So one of the things that came up in game one was a provocation by outside groups to run the Sunday before the election, right up through election night, of calls into the different FBI tip lines of civil rights violations. So that's a federal crime, of voter suppression in minority districts that just happened to be flooding the FBI field offices in all of the states that were being declared the swing states. The effort there was to provoke the FBI to act naturally, and the Justice Department to usurp vote counting authority from the states and claim it for itself pending the investigations of these alleged civil rights crimes, which turned out just to be a false flag operation to get a process started to mess things up.
But you bring up a really good point, that one of the vulnerabilities identified is this operating, and whether it, I think if you read the report, you'll see that whether it's the intelligence community, whether it's hostile foreign actors, however sliced, is that operating within that fog of war is the biggest primetime opportunity for this disruption. And it doesn't even need to be, like I said, it doesn't need to be at the, it doesn't even need to be at the Department of Justice level. Now, they might respond to it from a large nationwide perspective, but you could have that same effect in several micro pinpricks throughout the nation.
Back to the cartels for a minute, and you were doing the illegal aliens at the same time. I don't know that this was reflected in the game, but thinking if the game is continuing now and looking at interpreting things right now, how do you see illegal immigration, as we've seen over the past 3 years, being used concretely to get false voter registrations, to get numbers up so that the ballots equal the numbers of registered voters?
Right. Well, this could be, let me just start off with what we've done recently with heritage oversight, right? In North Carolina, which is a swing state. We went out knocking on doors in a area, this apartment complex that is primarily non-citizen, shall we say. And I mean, mostly illegal alien, but we'll say non-citizen. We went and knocked on the doors, and 10% of these people told us that they were non-citizens registered to vote. 10% of the people that we talked to. Right? So
This is in real life.
This is in real life. This is not right. This is not some sort of hypothetical scenario. And so 10%, I mean, you could extrapolate that out if that proportion holds true across the entire country, even if it's not, even if it's 5%, even if it's 1%, with all the non-citizens that are in this country, not just from the, not just those that have come under the Biden administration, but those who have come over the last few decades. I mean, we're looking at estimates of 40 or 50 million. So if you're talking even 1% of those people are registered to vote, that could be consequential. So that's some real life stuff. That's probably the most recent thing that we've done. I mean, we also uncovered flyers that are being distributed in Matamoros, Mexico. That's a critical passing point, not only for people that are coming over illegally, getting smuggled over by the cartel, but also people who are coming over via the CBP One app. For those who are not familiar, I mean, the federal government is actually, they've created an app where these people can get pre-approved, and then they can they basically get permission to come across a port of entry, and they're still legal aliens, but it's been done officially, right? So it's basically just done so that there's no press, that you don't see people getting smuggled over in the middle of the night by a cartel organization, right? So they have them come through with this app. But we saw in Matamoros, Mexico, that was the same town that I was picked up by the Gulf Cartel. There was a NGO there that was handing out flyers that were saying, when you get to the United States, make sure you vote for Joe Biden because we want to stay open.
And you found these on the ground?
We found these on the ground, correct. Yeah.
So now, whether we're in and out of the game, what opportunities does this give hostile actors like China, Russia, whoever else, to be interfering, not in just the vote counting, but the actual constitutional functioning of our republic?
Well, the first thing is there's sort of an ancillary effect that really benefits sort of all of these Eurasian autocracies, which is to basically prove that the American system is a failure. And so that's sort of a propaganda win. Very often America for decades has always pointed out, well, this regime is not functional compared to ours. They should be more like ours. So this allows for China in particular, but Russia as well, to sort of say, well, hey, you guys have a lot of problems. Who wants to be like this? So that's sort of a longer-term propaganda victory for the Chinese, and in the case that's who I played, but the Russians as well. There's also the ability for coordination. We've done a bang-up job, in my opinion, NATO has, of pushing Ukraine into the waiting arms of China. And so with that assumption in mind during the game, and I think we're seeing this play out in the real world, I leveraged that relationship with the Russia team. And we started coordinating to some degree some of the espionage activities we ramped up during the election, knowing that it will create maximum chaos. And chaos is really the goal here, because anything to undermine and weaken and distract the American leadership, which allows for China to do something against Taiwan, Russia to continue to make gains in Europe. We saw the Iranian nuclear detonation at one point, and in fact, I did at one point loop in Iran to try to kind of start complicating issues for the Americans. So all that this does, the constitutional, or the failure of our constitutional government allows for threat actors to come in, make it worse, slow things down, gum up the works, and make it harder for us to respond to whatever it is they're going to do abroad. And so things like, the Twitter bot farms, which seems sort of silly, but actually that can move the needle in terms of perception. And so China, Russia, they want to invest in things like that, not because they favor a candidate, although I do believe Joe Biden is probably the favored candidate of China, but because they just want the chaos, and they want America to be frozen in place while they do whatever they're going to do.
Well, they're doing it well.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are.
What are the takeaways can you bring from this exercise itself? Obviously, it was 5 days, and it was a short 5 days. I mean, to me, it went by really, really fast. So much more could have been done. And when you have strategic adversaries, whether they're state or non-state actors, working on this for years or decades, what are some of your other takeaways from this that we can learn from?
For me?
For all of you.
Well, the big takeaway here is that deterrence is dead. We are going to have to figure out how we're going to navigate this new multipolar environment. I'm talking about from the international relations standpoint. The U.S. government is completely blinkered. This goes beyond a Joe Biden issue. We are being geoeconomically encircled presently by China and Russia via the BRICS. They are going after our currency. They will probably be able to knock it down. And a Joe Biden presidency, or whoever is the Democratic Party's leader, if they win the presidency, they will ensure that the United States is a second-class power. And so for me, the ramifications are we need to be prepared in the near term to deter China, in particular, from even thinking about moving on Kinmen, Matsu, Penghu, or even directly blockading Taiwan, or worse.
Well, I have to say that, at least in my experience, what I've found is, again, this environment, this milieu of low social trust that is cultivated and able to be exploited mostly by some of the players in the game for the hostile actor side. But what we see, even folks, as our fellow Americans doing, we tend to see, I would say this, I've been saying people forgot how to disagree for decades now, but I think that we see it elevated to a place where it's actually virulent and weaponized at this point. And so in order to do that, in order to, I would say, forfend that, one of the things that needs to be done at the local level is essentially a reinvigoration of trust in institutions. And now, last I've checked, there's not a switch in every city hall that you just flip and says institutional trust and it turns on. That's actually going to be a project that actually needs to be undertaken by local government officials, and local government officials in and of themselves have been found wanting in this area as well, engaging in divisive rhetoric. I mean, what do I know about that? I'm only from the city of Austin. But that being said, I think that if once that local vanguard or that local buttress against social disorder falls, and that being law enforcement not the only but the primary one, I think that once that falls, that's something that in this particular scenario, we're going to see things get a lot worse before they get better, because at least in the simulations that we played, we saw that both municipal and county law enforcement were able to put the brakes on a lot of some of the bad intentions of hostile foreign actors, even if it was a second or third order effect.
Okay, so now, local municipal law enforcement is a first-line defender against our foreign adversaries.
Yeah, and it sounds crazy to say, oh, don't worry, the Montgomery County Sheriff will take care of China, but I mean, essentially, it has to be, because again, they are a important upheld local institution, and I'm not saying specifically Montgomery County, but just counties in general. That's the government that's closest to the people, and so whether we believe in the conservative ideal of subsidiarity, that's going to be the one that needs to be the strongest in its defense.
Great. So, which brings us to non-government actors. You got cartels. You also have Antifa, which is a transnational movement, more than just an idea, right? So, with a 100-year history. So, how do you see non-governmental movements influencing not just our security apparatus itself, but really our own political system? What are the net effects and the second and third order effects of your role activity in American politics?
Right. Well, what I will say is this. It's an interesting question. One of the things I see happening, and let's just talk about illegal immigrants. Right? Let's just start there. We have millions of people that are here illegitimately. They have no asylum case. But what's happening is they are now starting families here. As we go out and we do these door knocking campaigns with the Heritage Oversight Project, basically every home we go into, they have newborn children. Almost every single home, right, without fail. And even if the illegal alien that's there is a young girl, like we've knocked, and 16-year-old girls have a newborn baby, right, that they've had with a 30-year-old man. I mean, that's a different situation, right? That's not what we're talking about here. But as far as your question goes, so now we have all these people who are not American citizens, right? They don't have any allegiance to our republic. A lot of times they don't really have any comprehension of the English language, right? And these people are now having families here. They're becoming established here. And what I see is there is a critical window over the next few years where you can have mass deportation. We could sort of turn back the clock here and preserve our republic a bit, the integrity of our republic, right? Because what's going to happen is eventually, give it 20 years, these children are going to grow up, and they will come from a family that is not, a family of naturalized, legal American citizens. And I believe that inherently, degrades the fabric of our American republic when you have people that maybe don't necessarily come from a background that has any allegiance to our country or its founding values. It's a slippery slope, and it's not long before the fabric of our society degrades and we possibly enter into a despotic dictatorship.
Well, with 11 seconds left, that's a wrap. Thank you guys for having this event, and I hope we have more of these exercises.
I'd like to invite Chuck and Adam back up. We're about to do something that the 2020 Integrity Project would never have done. That was a shadowy, secretive group. We want to talk to you and take your questions. And let me open with first an observation and then a challenge. And I deliver this with as much respect as I can. We are gracious hosts here at Heritage, and this is directed at no one in the room in particular. But nobody has lied to the American people more than the media. You also have been lied to quite a bit recently as well. President Biden and his administration have made the media out to be fools. What the American people saw last week on primetime television is what a lot of reporters have seen up close for the last 3.5 years. Now's an opportunity to reclaim the institution of journalism in America. And I think that is vitally important at this moment in time. The threats to our constitutional republic are dire. We all know what logical outcomes can occur after a highly contested election that we all expect. It is imperative now more than ever to anticipate those threats and be prepared to report on them accurately. And so that is my challenge to our friends in the media who are here today. But now we're going to open up for questions. We have a microphone that'll be taken to you. Just raise your hand. Just please identify who you're with when you introduce yourself.
Hi, Augustus Alzona, Asian, Filipino, Catholic American male. That's how I identify. In the last panel there, and also whatever AI bots or things you're using here, one thing came to mind, and I'm speaking as somebody who's been in this town since, this is my adopted city of Washington, since 1955. There was and I'm not drawing any analogies or inferences, but there was a mayor here, the highest elected official, Marion Barry, and he was elected twice for mayor and 3 times for city council here, despite the objections of the Washington Post and, if you want to call it, whoever it is, their editorial board and over there, and despite him getting caught in all these scandals, et cetera, involving sex and drugs, et cetera. But nonetheless, he was reelected. I guess you could say he was a populist with the core constituencies here within his district. But that aside, may I suggest, if you're going to run another AI scenario where you have a populist leader who was embroiled in scandal but is doing or has done things in opposition to the Western European white liberal worldview, et cetera, maybe that might be something you might want to factor that in and get the reactions of the people who supporting the populists. I don't know if that makes any sense. I know I'm kind of like going at a kind of a high level here, but anyway, so here's the question, is that possible that you all may be able to put that into your gaming scenario concerning the finality of this upcoming election?
I would say it's in there. In the report, we have different characters that reflect some of the sentiments you just discussed. I don't know if you all want to go into more detail, but the answer to your question is yes, it's in the report.
Well, in one of the scenarios, the Biden administration arrested President Trump 2 days after the election on charges of insurrection and classified documents improprieties, right? And the president was under house arrest and ended up in the scenario doing really large online rallies. And so it became pretty apparent that it would not be a tenable situation to try to continue down that path because the American people were having none of it.
Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think that it's important to game out the responses from Trump's possible supporters. I think that if we see the kind of manipulations that we saw in 2020, I wonder if average Americans who are supporters of the president will swallow that so easily as they did in 2020. That's an open question. It's one that I hope we don't have to find the answer to.
Yeah, hi. It's Gary, one of those media types from AP. How are you?
Hey, Gary.
Hey there. My question is, so who is the audience? What is the end game here? Who are we trying to actually engage? Is it the law enforcement to be on the lookout? Are we talking about the election officials to be on the lookout? Are we talking about the American public? And especially to be on the lookout for terrorism if the current president decides he's going to use force not to leave the White House, who's supposed to respond?
All of the above. If we're going to have a fair, free, legal election, all of the interest holders that you just mentioned are going to need to be proactive in anticipating some of the problems that we saw arise in these exercises.
Yeah, I can add to some of that. That's a great question, by the way. Thank you. One of the things that happened in one of the scenarios was that there was a claim made that came out of the administration about threats against election officials, and it resulted in that scenario in significant resignations of campaign workers, mostly Democratic campaign workers in some of these more liberal jurisdictions. And so when you look at that, and when you look at the fact that there has been similar threats made in the past, and you look at the declining participation rate among Americans in doing things like being a poll worker or being a poll watcher, one of the critical things, especially when you look at like the average age of the people who do this, that seems to keep going up and up and up, our system requires an enormous number of Americans who, out of civic obligation, volunteer to help administer their local elections, to be at the local level, at the precinct level, to not only administer and check people in some jurisdictions, you know, you're going to check ID, and others they don't check ID, but nevertheless to check off that this is the voter who came, everything's in order, here's your ballot, you know, here's how you vote, to help them if they're having problems, and then to have people from both major parties or even independent groups that go through, in many cases you have to get trained. You have to have proper training to be able to participate as a poll watcher. And all of this is taking place in a context where you see fewer and fewer people willing to do this every year. And that is absolutely critical as the first line of defense in our representative democracy, to have Americans willing to step up to the plate and to be part of this very American civic involvement. And so that's one of the things that we're hoping that this report will result in. One more thing is that it is absolutely vital that people who are attorneys who are admitted to practice law in a particular state and have some degree of familiarity with the election code in that state, that they make themselves available to process any sort of lawsuits or claims, legal claims, to force local jurisdictions to adhere to the election law in that jurisdiction. That is another thing, because if you don't bring a suit in some of these cases, nothing will happen. The bad behavior, the illegal behavior will not be corrected if you don't bring a suit. And so those sorts of individuals as well need to be ready and need to be prepared to volunteer and in many cases provide pro bono legal assistance.
I'll add one constituency I would say, Gary, is at the top of my list for who I hope reads this report is the American public, because I believe it's important that they are fortifying their psychological defenses from the operations that will be run on them. And what I mean there is in 2020, sophisticated psychological and media operations were run on the American people to prime them to accept an absurdly run election. These operations obviously were designed around supporting the notion that we can securely vote by mail and with unmonitored drop boxes, and ballots can be dropped off at 3 a.m., pipes can burst in Georgia, and that's all normal. That's how democracy works. There was a fundamental change to the country that occurred in 2020 in the way we elect our elected leaders. And the psychological operations that were used to support those notions, I think were hugely impactful in a negative way. And so the highest aim of this report, in my mind, is to start to gird the defenses of the American people so they can sniff out some of these schemes when they see them coming around this time.
They also need to work to document what they see. I think that 2020 showed that simple statistical anomalies will not be enough to motivate judges to allow cases to go forward. I don't think we're going to be allowed to find the fraud by filing suits. We've got to have it on the front end and then file the suit. This demands that people are in and around where their election is happening and that they're documenting what they see.
Another media type, Liz Landers with Scripps News. Thanks for taking some questions. I appreciate it. You were mentioning kind of preparing the American public, but I'm wondering what Heritage is doing specifically on this. Can you talk about how much money you guys are going to spend to potentially bring lawsuits post-election? I know that that was a big post-2020 election day pursuit from the Trump campaign. They brought 60 or so lawsuits. They were thrown out. But I'm wondering if you guys are going to be part of that effort post-November election. And also, just because Project 2025 has been in the news a lot, how does this relate to that? Is it related? Is this going to be folded into Project 2025? And have you talked with the Trump campaign about this portion and this report and this war game that you've done?
Sure. I'll do my best to answer all of those. So as a 501c3, we do not engage in partisan politics. And so no to your question about coordination with the Trump campaign on any of this. With regard to the litigation aspect, the Heritage Oversight Project has sued President Biden's administration almost 100 times and will continue to do so. Most of those matters, as of late, relate to election integrity issues. And so our goal is to solve some of these problems before the election, because as just previously mentioned, if you don't get at it before, it's very hard to unwind. If, for instance, you made reference to cases being thrown out of court, which has become kind of public lore and a statistics that's often cited. What most American people don't realize is that those cases were largely thrown out on procedural grounds or technical grounds. They were not a true hearing of evidence or substance. We have had some of those displays in recent recounts and events in Arizona and Georgia, but in terms of the post-2020 election, immediately after the election, things were thrown out on technical grounds. It wasn't a full hearing or investigation into the conduct of the election itself, which is why the numbers of people who do not trust that election, I'd venture to say, have increased since the election, what was held and more evidence has come out. In terms of resources, this is a critical moment in our country's history. I mean, I do not say with any exaggeration that our constitutional republic's in dire straits. And so to that end, the Heritage Foundation and the enterprise will spare no resource at its disposal to fight to save this country from those problems. We have a C4 associated with us, the Heritage Action, which does voter registration work, which is distinct from the C3. And then Project 2025 is an entity unto itself with no formal affiliation with the Transition Integrity Project. The Transition Integrity Project is a standalone group. The Heritage Foundation and myself are hosting the group today. And I hope I got all of them.
Thank you. Did you guys war game the following, what I believe to be very likely scenario, which is in September, Judge Marchand will have his sentencing hearing of President Trump, and he'll say 34 counts, felony counts of 4 years each. That's 136 years in prison, but I'm very lenient, so I'm only sentencing you to 60 years in prison. Bailiff, please take him away right now to Rikers Island.
That's a great question. The guidance I gave to the 50 people who participated, the short answer is no, we didn't, and here's why. This is an election, our goal was to run an election academic exercise. And so I had some really big no's, right? Do not start World War III. This is not about World War III. This is about the 2024 election. No assassinations. So there's going to be no, and because we knew that President Biden's mental capacity is at risk, I told all the players, look, there's a lot of unknowns, but just presume it's agnostic who the actual nominees are from both major parties, right? That we're setting that aside. What we want to look at are the nuts and bolts of what might happen apart from those big, huge events like the one you just outlined. So we purposefully did not go through that, although in one of the games, as I mentioned, 2 days after the election, and this was the scenario where Trump had a larger electoral college victory. And one, it all came down to Arizona, and the other, it was a bigger margin of victory. In that one, as I recall, Trump was arrested by the DOJ 2 days after the election.
One back there.
Thanks. Hi, Isaac Arnser for the Washington Post. Could you elaborate on what you see as nefarious about the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division monitoring compliance with federal voting rights regulation laws, federal voting rights laws, as it has in every election since 1965?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the weaponization of the Department of Justice is a deeply held conviction amongst Americans at this point. They see a department that is supposed to neutrally enforce the law that has done so in a purely partisan manner, in frankly, a very reckless and violent manner. And the investments that you're seeing being made into the Department of Justice Office of Civil Rights are into hard left prosecutors who are going out there to prosecute people under the color of theory of voter intimidation and suppression. This is what we saw in the case where a individual who posted a meme about the election being on a different date, a common election joke that goes around on the internet. The Department of Justice prosecuted this individual despite the fact that there are countless other examples of people making that exact same joke. And so when you're looking at a weaponized Department of Justice, one in which is led by Merrick Garland, one of the most corrupt individuals in American government history, as demonstrated by ample evidence, Americans see they're playing in the election system as another weaponized event. To put it simply, the federal government should have a very limited role in our election systems. They should be left to the states to decide. Weaponizing civil rights law is really ultimately, at the end of the day, a violation of civil rights law. What's happening right now to Americans across the country, and President Trump in particular, is that his civil rights are being violated. The civil rights of the people who want to vote for him and organize for him are being violated. You're seeing campaign fines being enacted at exorbitant rates through a perversion of the legal system. And so, yes, when Merrick Garland and his cronies of the Department of Justice pop their heads up with these announcements, Americans are very right to be concerned that these civil rights laws, being weaponized against them is of massive concern, just like the threats to the Supreme Court are right now. And it's something you may well know quite a bit about. The leak of the Dobbs opinion was one of such attacks that has been used to basically, by Joe Biden and his administration, to put a political hit out on the Supreme Court. And it started with that leak that I know you've covered so much. But I appreciate your question, and unless you guys...
I would just add that the leftists in media and government are very fond of saying no one's above the law. And that's true, but no one's beneath the law either. And that's the problem with the involvement of these entities, is that they favor some citizens' legal rights over other citizens' legal rights. Once we can neutralize and bring a balance to these agencies, then there may be some space for where they could involve themselves in state-run elections. Until then, they need to stay out.
And with that, I'm sorry, there's a lot of more questions I know you all have. We're running up against a strict timeline. That being said, we will make ourselves available to continue these conversations, take your questions, whether by email, phone, conference call. We are not like the 2020 shadowy Transition Integrity Project. This is for the people, by the people, and we intend, no matter where you are on the ideological or political spectrum, to continue to answer those questions. But to close us out, we're going to bring up the president of the Heritage Foundation to be introduced by Chuck.
Well, I have the distinct honor of introducing Dr. Kevin Roberts, who currently serves as the president of the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action for America. He's also my former boss out in Texas, which is where I first met him. He previously served as the chief executive officer of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is based in Austin. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute, and it's the largest state-based think tank in the nation. Prior to TPPF, Dr. Roberts was president of the Wyoming Catholic College in Leander, Wyoming. I think that one of the things they're referred to is the Cowboy Catholics, which I just love that moniker. He earned his PhD in American history from the University of Texas. Of course, if you were in Austin, you'd hear, of course, the back and forth tension between those from A&M and those from UT. But we're in D.C., so you don't hear any of that. After several years of teaching history at the collegiate level, Dr. Roberts in 2006 left the university to found the John Paul the Great Academy, a co-ed K-12 Catholic liberal arts school in Lafayette, Louisiana. Dr. Roberts served as the Academy's president and headmaster for 7 years. In addition to his doctorate, Dr. Roberts holds a master's degree in history from Virginia Tech and a bachelor's degree in history from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He was selected as the 7th president of the Heritage Foundation in October 2021 and continues to lead policy research efforts on many of the issues he championed at TPPF, including education, healthcare, border security, election integrity, and more. At a time when so many bad ideas are coming out of Washington, his experience in advancing sound policy at the state and national levels has been vital to both the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Kevin Roberts.
you.
Thanks, Chuck. Always great to see Chuck DeVore. You know, for a native Californian, it's great that he's wearing boots, especially in Washington, D.C. Look, there are many things in this country to be worried about. One of them, of course, is election integrity. And so I'm really proud, obviously, of my heritage colleagues, of my former colleague and friend, Chuck DeVore, for this work. But I'm particularly proud of all of you who've been part of this terrific project. And precisely for one reason. Not just that election integrity is a worry for a majority of Americans across the political spectrum, but to that point, this is neither a left problem or a right problem. It's an American problem. And as I have mentioned to members of the media recently, particularly, say, left of center media outlets, whom we love and respect but disagree with, that we have to aspire in this country to get back to an election cycle when every American wakes up and believes that their vote will be counted, that there will be a successful transition, that there are no longer any problems with election integrity. We at Heritage, we at the Transition Integrity Project care as deeply about the integrity of votes for people who might vote differently than people on the right as we do about, quote unquote, our people. And I still like to think that America is a great enough place where that might be eventually a point we can all agree on. This is personified by our friend, Senator Torricelli. Thank you so much. Torricelli, thanks so much for being part of this, personifying this need for getting back to bipartisan work on election integrity. On behalf of all Americans, this project, our own work at the Heritage Foundation and Heritage Action, will be zealously focused on making sure that every single person who is eligible to vote and wants to gets their vote counted. And conversely, in order to protect the integrity of their votes, that every single person who ought not be voting because they are ineligible, maybe they're an illegal alien, maybe they're not alive, doesn't vote. I grew up in Louisiana, and so I know a little bit of election fraud anecdotally, but I won't share those stories with you. I think you've probably seen them. If you want some evidence of that, you can go to our Heritage Election Fraud Database. You can, of course, follow the great work of the Oversight Project, credit the Secretary of State in Indiana, who's taken some great steps, the great state of Texas, of course, which continues to take great steps. But most of all, in this season of great discontent and great manifested toxicity by really bad coverage of really important issues facing not just Americans today, but the future of this republic. I applaud the work of the Transition Integrity Project, Mike and my colleagues, but more importantly, all of you, and let us aspire to an America where we can wake up and say, even if an election didn't go the way we wanted, politically or in terms of policy outcomes, we at least can be proud that this remains the last best hope on the face of the earth. I grew up in an America where both the left and right agreed to that, and if Heritage has its way, we're going to get back to it. God bless you.